Welcome. My name is Tony Carter. I'm the pastor of East Point Church in East Point, Georgia. And I'm pleased to have join us on the front porch today the esteemed Dr. Vincent Bacote. He's a professor at Wheaton College. And Dr. Bacote, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, and thank you for calling me esteemed. That's very nice of you.
Now, I said that you're a professor at Wheaton College
Right.
up in Illinois. Could you tell us a little bit about your specialty, where you serve?
Sure. So I teach theology, which means I teach doctrine, basically. So, or if I, like I say to kids, I teach people about God, but which is different from if I just teach biblical studies. So I'm not just looking at the particulars of Old Testament or New Testament. I'm teaching, Christology, doctrine of the Spirit, what is the church, questions like that. And also direct our Center for Applied Christian Ethics, which is not what I thought I would have been doing.
Okay.
If you had said to me 10 years ago, I think you'll be directing the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College, I would have said, I don't think so. Then one day my chair came into my office, said that the then director was leaving and that he thought I should do it.
Oh.
And now I'm glad he did that, because it's a great opportunity for me to work to put together events that are related to cultural engagement and getting people to think about how to develop Christian moral discernment.
Well, tell us a little bit about your education. Where did you go to school, and what made you pursue education all the way up to the PhD level and then become a professor yourself?
Well, when I went to college, I wanted to be a veterinarian. So my undergrad degree is actually in biology. But even from the age of being a small child, I was interested in spiritual things. And it occurred to me recently that it's perhaps peculiar, at least at my church anyway, that when I was 13, I was asking about going to Bible study when nobody else's kids were pretty much asking about that. But I was very interested in those things. But while I was in college, in the middle of it, I began to think about the possibility of what I now call, full-time Christian service. The only form, though, that I thought that could be at that time was either being a senior pastor or being a parachurch worker. I didn't know that being a professor was something that was even a valid thing. After I graduated, I went to school at the Citadel, the military college of South Carolina. I lived in Memphis, Tennessee for 3 years, and with the guy who was on staff with the Navigators, and was thinking about, okay, is it going to be veterinary school or is it going to be seminary? Pretty quickly, it was seminary. Then in navigating that, I chose Trinity Divinity School, started there in fall of 1990. Before starting there, I was starting to feel a little bit ill at ease about just pursuing being a senior pastor. But I still didn't have any categories other than being a senior pastor or being a parachurch worker, like someone who worked for the Navigators. And the interesting about that is that I knew there were going to be people there, like professors who taught these topics, but the idea of being one of those people never occurred to me. And the irony is that it was a Navigator staff guy who said to me after my first quarter, I got all A's, he goes, Vince, a guy like you ought to get a PhD. And then he laid out what I could do with that. It was like someone turning on a light, actually.
Wow.
And the reason that's ironic is that the Navigators are a very practically oriented organization. And at least in my experience of it, the way that certain things were impressed upon me, it wasn't like a context where people were going to be encouraged to be pursuing a PhD and becoming theology professors, much more oriented towards either being a parachurch worker or a pastor. So it actually took me a year really to be comfortable telling people that I was going to go this path of being a professor, which wasn't exclusive of preaching, and because I definitely still wanted to do that, but the home base was going to be being a professor. So I was at Trinity from 90 to 94. I like to say that in retrospect now, I discovered that I was one of them while I was there.
Who is one of them?
One of them being a professor, right? And I was one of these people who was always going around talking to professors, and so I was always hanging out with professors by the time I graduated. And then I got my PhD at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And when I went to seminary, I didn't know that I was going to be in grad school the entire decade of the 90s, basically, but that's how it worked out. And I started at Wheaton in January of 2000 with one chapter of my dissertation finished, and I finished that over the next 2 summers, and then defended my dissertation the Monday following the World Trade Center went down. So it was kind of interesting flying back to Newark when You had to get really early in the morning and very early in the morning, and fly in and defend that.
Well, that kind of puts it in perspective. That'll be an event that you will always remember.
Oh, yes.
That day. I was wondering why you was able to recall it so quickly.
Oh, yes.
Speaking of that, though, your PhD, your area of study, your dissertation, it was on Abraham Kuyper.
Right.
And tell us a little bit why Abraham Kuyper.
Sure.
And
why Abraham Kuyper? Not because I grew up Dutch Reformed, because I didn't. So I grew up in a National Baptist church, actually, but it basically comes down because I'm a person who's very much about cultural engagement, and I had a sense that Christians should be culturally engaged, but I didn't have any theological categories for that. So when I read Kuyper, that's when I finally read some theological language with that. And then someone suggested that if I was thinking about that for Kuyper as a dissertation figure, then is there some relationship between his doctrine of the Holy Spirit and his theology of culture and politics? And what I discovered was his language for the doctrine of common grace and his language for how the Holy Spirit works in creation, that you can just kind of do this. And fortunately, nobody else wrote a dissertation about that, so that was a relief. And that's how. And that was the topic that I wound pursuing when I got around to do my dissertation.
Now, Kuyper was kind of a Renaissance man.
Yes.
He was a theologian, a professor,
a
politician, a journalist, big public figure, well known.
Yes.
And so, in his own time, he was known for that idea of cultural engagement, and apparently that really caught your attention. But when you began to read Kuyper, you came across some interesting things about his writings that were not so appealing.
That's right.
And how did you reconcile some of his unique views on ethnicities and things?
Well, that was really interesting, because while I was in seminary and being enamored with some of the language of cultural engagement, the crisis came particularly to a head when I read this quote. He's contrasting election, evolution, and then says, if you're a plant, you'd rather be a rose than a mushroom. If you're a bird, an eagle rather than an owl. If a higher vertebrate, a lion rather than a hyena. Being man, rich rather than poor, talented rather than dull-minded. And then of the Aryan race, than Hottentot or Kaffir.
Wow.
Now, this was a crisis, as you can imagine, because I was really excited about kind of, going with Kuyper all the way, and now, so what am I going to do with this? And it's really how I became a critical thinker, because what happened, I had to ask the question, is this language about race central to his entire project, or is it peripheral to his project? And basically what I concluded was the language about cultural engagement and most of his project, in fact, was not at all related in any necessary way to that language about race. And in fact, his theology actually undermines that. But the way I like to put it is to say that even though his theology would undermine those positions, he couldn't overcome the gravitational pull of his cultural commitments. Wow. So he never really articulated, in practice, language that articulated in terms of his actual language and in terms of anything, in terms of policy, anything that would sort of overturn things like slavery. Though he even says, in his 1898, yeah, not 1998, that's for sure. His 1898 Stone Lectures that, and he's particularly talking about the Calvinist form of Christianity, that you get equality from this. So the language is there about equality.
Right.
And yet in that language about equality, he even does make certain qualifiers about what God does in providence and putting people in certain places, et cetera, or gifting people in certain ways. But the fact is that there's that fundamental commitment to equality. And because of that, he says there shouldn't be, any sense in which men or women think they're better than each other, or why there should be systems of slavery, things like that. And he also has an idea called multiformity, actually, that he talks about in a couple of other places. And the point about that is that it's sort of like a kind of a multicultural type of thing, where he recognizes that no one culture has all knowledge themselves, and that other cultures may have understandings of reality that others don't.
Yeah.
And the point is that if you recognize that, then there's at least on paper an openness to the fact that all other cultures really might have something that you can learn from. So it's kind of hard to have in practice a cultural superiority, though he did in practice have that cultural superiority.
Well, a lot of young students, particularly African American students, like to study theology and have heroes in the past that they read about, particularly in Reformed tradition, and they get excited when they read these men, and then suddenly they come across a statement or a position that these men might have held or defended, or maybe didn't defend as strongly as they probably should have, and they become disillusioned with these individuals.
Right.
How would you kind of counsel them and speak to them about, admiring these men and the theology that they held to, and yet being reminded that they were still yet men?
I think the first thing is to recognize that any figure is going to eventually disappoint you. So you shouldn't. You get excited about whatever you discover in them, but of course, whatever you're discovering in them is in no way the entirety of who this is as a person or everything that they think. And the more you spend time with them, I mean, you're eventually getting closer and closer to the day of disappointment. And when the day of disappointment arrives, I mean, here's the interesting thing. I mean, if you're reformed in your theology and you really believe in depravity, you really shouldn't be surprised, because it should occur to you that at some point you're going to see that the sinfulness of this person is going to be on display. Which doesn't mean that if you're reformed, by definition, you always think you have a worm theology, but the whole point is that if you have a robust doctrine of sin, it shouldn't surprise you that you see ways that sin has its effects on people, in ways that they have things that they struggle with and that they can't overcome, or ways that they are in cultural contexts that we might be able to see now reasons why they should be able to transcend it, but they didn't successfully do that. So what we have to be able to do is be honest about it and say, this is really disappointing. But to say that something is disappointing doesn't mean that you have to jettison everything that they said. I mean, this is what critical thinking is all about. I mean, doing the work of saying, what can I affirm here? What can I critique here? What can I own? What can't I own? And really, even with figures you hardly like, there might be some reason to read these people because there are a lot of things you can learn from them, and still say, there's a lot of stuff about them that bothers me, but there's some things they tell the truth about, or because they talk about a topic that maybe other people aren't talking about, maybe there's something I can learn about this topic from this person, even if I don't agree with their approach to that topic. And in fact, another way to think about it is this way. If you read a theologian or a figure who is someone who's definitely not, in the same playing field as you are, it might be interesting to ask yourself a question like this. Why are they on that playing field and not my playing field? And if they're not on my playing field, how would I get them on my playing field? And if they see something on my playing field that they think makes it impossible for them to come over to my playing field, what's going to be my conversational strategy with those people to at least try to get them to understand with integrity what's going on in this playing field, as opposed to perhaps a caricatured view of what's going on in this field? Because a lot of times people wind up on other playing fields because of some bad experience, or because of an implication they think must be drawn from certain positions. But if we're being, I think, appropriately rigorous, I think we'll ask questions like, well, how would I get them over here? Seriously, how would I do that without just saying, well, I just think they're kind of wacky? Now you might in the end decide they're kind of wacky, but before you finally say that, you need to ask the question, why are they over there and not here? Because a lot of times we don't ask that question, why are they over there? We just go, wow, they're over there, right? Well, we need to ask, if we want them here, how would we get them here? Yeah, as opposed to just saying, they're wrong.
Now, I first became acquainted with you through your book, Spirit of Public Theology, Appropriating the Legacy of Abraham Kuyper.
Yeah, it's a very long title.
Yeah, very long title. But it's very interesting. It's a very interesting book, and I found it really engaging because I'm kind of a fan of the Dutch Reformed philosophies and theologies, and so I'm wondering if you could just help us a little bit. How do we appropriate the legacy of Kuyper, and why do you believe it's important that Christians today recover?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is Kuyper is a good figure for helping us to think about why Christians ought to be involved in every area of life. But also, interestingly, not just that you can be publicly engaged, but also a person who takes their personal piety seriously. Because yes, Kuyper is this person that went on to be prime minister, but he also wrote a lot of devotionals. So this isn't just someone who was all about, let's just get out there in the public and who cares about your personal piety, because sometimes there are people who only care about what's out there and don't care as much about what's in here, or the people only care about what's in here or don't care about what's out there. And really in Kuyper, you actually did have both of those things. I mean, he definitely had his imperfections, but he is a good example of a culturally engaged theological figure. I think that the way to appropriate it isn't necessarily by just repeating everything that he said. I think we have to critically engage him as well. But I think we do see in him, in what he modeled with his life, as well as doctrines like the doctrine of common grace, let's say. I mean, these are things that help us to think about why it's an ongoing Christian responsibility to participate in the public dimensions and not just the private dimensions. Or a way to put it is that life beyond Sunday is something that is a domain of Christian participation as much as Sunday is.
Yeah.
So I think he's important for that. But I call myself a neo-Kuyperian because here's the thing: Kuyper was called a neo-Calvinist.
That's right.
So, and let me just say for the camera, there are other ways that people use the term neo-Calvinist. They're not talking about Kuyper when they're talking about neo-Calvinist. So we got to make that distinction. That's more neo-Puritan, to be honest. So the neo-Calvinism of Kuyper was in part a label given to him because he was taking Calvinism and talking about it more as sort of a worldview type thing and not just as a kind of church theological system. So, and part of what he was doing there is he's trying to find a way to articulate, that a faith that's public and private, reaches to every area of life, and the point is not that we have to do everything exactly like he did, but we can take a cue from that and say, all right, what are the issues of our day that we need to attend to and have a proper theological approach to, so that people see that, well, our theology actually does speak to these things. Because sometimes I think people feel like the Christian faith doesn't speak to the struggle or this issue, and what I want to say is, well, are you sure about that? And if your answer is no, why is your answer no? I think the Christian faith does speak to these other issues, for example, because the created order is God's idea, and Christians are people who should be participating in God's created order. I mean, I think that's always been what we're supposed to be doing. And in that participation, there are things that we discover, and also in the way that we look at the entirety, I think, of the biblical record, we see language that I think orients us towards this ongoing participation. So Kuyper is someone who helps us to be inspired to do that. But I think then the neo-Kuyperian move is to say, I look at his legacy and I see what I can bring over. But just as he says, to repress the nation, I'm as averse as any man. His whole point wasn't just cutting and pasting. So how do I bring it here, hold on to dimensions of the tradition that I need to hold on to, but also say, okay, some of that needs to stay in the 19th century, and there are other things that I need to bring to it here in the 21st century. So he did that. We need to be inspired to do the same.
Yeah. When you're teaching and the students are coming there at Wheaton, and you have an opportunity to influence them and to even speak to them about the influence that Kuyper has had on you, are there any encouraging signs you see in this generation of students who are seeking to engage the culture in a Kuyperian way?
Well, what I would say is this: is that I don't always use Kuiper's name
Okay.
when I'm giving them Kuiper,
Okay.
because sometimes, you give them the name later after you've given them the content, because they're like, well, who's this guy? But I think what we find writ large is that I think there's a desire for a holistic faith. And the interesting thing about it is that just as I had an intuition, in my college years, I think for most of the millennials that have a desire to have a holistic faith, for most of them, it's intuitional. They can't really give you a biblical or theological argument for why Christians ought to be involved. One of the reasons I think Shane Claiborne's been so popular is that, or for some people, they read Stanley Hauerwas, that's really appealing to them, is because here's someone who gives them a kind of robust doctrine of church, and it's out of a church identity that they see a way to be involved in public as church. I think the Kuiperian model is, of course, perhaps a little bit more robust, a little more helpful. But I think the point is that they're looking for someone to help them to see why their faith and life matters. Right. So I do tend to see the students appreciate it when I'm telling them that, I said, look, most of you aren't going into full-time ministry for a living. So how is what you're going to be doing with most of the hours of your week, how's that going to matter to God? And how's your faith going to make any discernible difference in those things? And I try to, through that kind of question, sort of move them towards seeing why really various dimensions of their Christian beliefs play a role there. So if I'm talking about Christology, I say, look, Jesus came in the flesh. The fact that he's coming in the flesh, this is an affirmation of the goodness of the created order. I like to say it's like an echo of Genesis 1:31. God said it was very good. In Genesis 1:31, Jesus being incarnate is saying, yes, in case you forgot, it is very good, and I'm coming here to redeem this. And what that means, though, is that their lives as created beings have great significance and import, and not just when they're doing evangelism, but when they're participating in whatever their vocations are.
Well, I'm sure they appreciate the work that you do at Wheaton and your opportunities to teach them, because I appreciate the work that you do, and I've learned from you, and I hope in the future to continue to learn from you. Thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
All right.